Welcome back for part three. Before we get started, hey, yeah, there you are, Kitty. Look who decided to join us. He takes up most of the table, so I'm going to be kind of squished as I talk to you, but he's a huge kitty, I'll tell you. He needs to go on a diet. But anyway, there's your Charlie sighting for today. All right, we talked about the school year and how everything kind of goes through the school year and you see a change slowly but surely over the course of the school year, and I think the book works very well on that. The next question has to do with Via, and I said in the question that I thought she was the most interesting character after Augie, and some of you agreed, and some of you, said, well, I like some other characters besides, and that's fine. But I think, a lot of kids who read this book probably are in Via's situation, and it's kind of nice to have a story about a character in this kind of situation. And I don't mean, having a sibling who has, a terrible disease that disfigures them. I'm talking about a sibling who, for whatever reason, is kind of in the shadow of a younger or an older sibling. And, that happens, maybe more than we want to admit to. For whatever reason, the little brother or little sister or big brother or big sister gets all the attention, and the other child is kind of on the outskirts, kind of looking on the outskirts, looking in, and just kind of feels like they're not getting the same attention and the same amount of love. And so I find her story very fascinating. At one point she says, I had to be the good one. I had to be the self-sufficient one because, my parents just couldn't take one more thing because of all that they were dealing with Augie. And there is a passage from the book that I do want to read. It's 82, 83. And of course, she's the narrator. She says, August is the sun. Me and Mom and Dad are planets orbiting the sun. And that's the way it's always been. The rest of our family and friends are asteroids and comets floating around the planets orbiting the sun. The only celestial body that doesn't orbit August, the sun, is Daisy the dog. And that's only because, to her little doggy eyes, August's face doesn't look very different from any other human's face. To Daisy, all of our faces look alike, as flat and pale as the moon. And of course, I could do a whole segment on Daisy, but I won't because I'll start to cry. So, but the dog doesn't see ugly or beautiful; she just sees humans. Via goes on to say, "I'm used to the way this universe works. I've always understood that August is special and has special needs. Mom and Dad would always say I was the most understanding little girl in the world. I don't know about that, just that I understood that there was no point in complaining. I've seen August after his surgeries, his little face bandaged up and swollen, his tiny body full of IVs and tubes to keep him alive. After you've seen someone else going through that, it feels kind of crazy to complain over not getting the toy you asked for or your mom missing a school play," which is kind of foreshadowing and ironic for the later scene, obviously. "I knew this even when I was 6 years old. No one ever told it to me. I just knew it." And then a little bit later, she says, "My worst day, worst fall, worst headache, worst bruise, worst cramp, worst mean thing anyone could say has always been nothing compared to what August has gone through. This isn't me being noble, by the way. It's just the way I know it is. And this is the way it's always been for me, for the little universe of us. But this year there seems to be a shift in the cosmos. The galaxy is changing. Planets are falling out of alignment." And of course, there's a little bit of foreshadowing to a lot of the sort of changes, mostly good, that are about to occur in her life, and Augie's too. So that's one of the highlights of her narration. And I like that subplot of the sibling who is it kind of ignored, and not for lack of love. Certainly her parents love her. But when you have a situation like Augie's, he gets all the attention. He gets all the time. He gets all the effort. And she's kind of left behind. And I think a lot of kids could relate to that, even if they're not in the particular situation that she's in. The climax of the story, I saw a number of different answers to this, and that's always subject to interpretation. Obviously, the climax should be something that happens toward the end of the story that seems to resolve any conflicts, or it's maybe what everything's been building up to in the story. My main two nominees for climax, and I think most people picked either one or the other, would be the nature retreat that they do toward the end of the year, where their school joins other schools for this nature retreat, and particularly the scene where they're picked on. August is picked on by a group of seventh graders from another school, and they are sort of rescued by Amos and several others who have been picking on Augie all school year, practically, but show, again, kindness and support and defend the two boys, and they kind of get the better of the fight. August gets roughed up pretty much, and his hearing aid is hurt, is destroyed, and so on. But he comes out of it, and it's kind of. I think this scene is kind of interesting because it shows, again, by the end of the school year, everybody's kind of used to Augie, and maybe even kind of secretly like him. And I think the action by Amos and the others kind of show that, hey, he may be weird looking, but he may be a weird kid, but he's our weird kid. And, we can maybe talk about him or tease him a little bit, but somebody on the outside, those seventh graders from the other class, he's one of us. He's one of ours. So if somebody picks on one of ours, we're going to fight back and we're going to defend him. And, I think that's an interesting, sub-theme to the story as well. He's one of ours now, and how dare you, an outsider, pick on him? So we're gonna fight you. And I love that scene. And, that's maybe the ultimate indication that Augie has finally been accepted. And of course, he mentions too afterwards, the stories grow and grow about the fight and so on, and everybody makes a big deal of it and looks at him in a different way, and I think you could call that the climax. Other people said that Tushman's speech at the end is kind of a climactic moment. Certainly, the story pretty much ends there when Augie gets his award, and I do want to read a little bit of this. This is particularly well done in the movie, so if you want to see the movie. But this is a nice way to tie up, all the different themes that we see in the story. And here's where Tushman is about ready to announce this final, very prestigious award. Here the weirdest thing happened. Mr. Tushman's voice cracked a bit, like he got all choked up. He actually cleared his throat and took a big sip of water. I started paying attention, for real now, to what he was saying. The strength of one's courage, he repeated quietly, nodding and smiling. He held up his right hand like he was counting off. Courage, kindness, friendship, character. These are the qualities that define us as human beings and propel us, on occasion, to greatness. This is what the Henry Ward Beecher Medal is about, recognizing greatness. But how do we do that? How do we measure something like greatness? Again, there's no yardstick for that kind of thing. How do we even define it? Well, Beecher actually had an answer for that. Greatness, wrote Beecher, lies not in being strong, but in the right using of strength. He is the greatest whose strength carries up the most hearts. And again, out of the blue, he got all choked up. Augustus notes, or Augie notes. I keep on saying Augustus because I teach the other book too. He is the greatest, he finally continued, whose strength carries up the most hearts by the attraction of his own. Without further ado, this year I'm very proud to award the Henry Ward Beecher Medal to the student whose quiet strength has carried up the most hearts. So will August Pullman please come up here to receive this award? And again, Augie then, describes the feeling of this. And one of the lines he says earlier about Villa, but it kind of applies to him too. He says, he says something to the effect, I wish everybody in their lives had the opportunity at least once to get a standing ovation. And I think that's a nice way to kind of put a nice bow on this whole scene. And I think that's kind of the climactic moment. There's just a little epilogue after that where, they have a party afterwards and so on. And the very last words are his mother saying that, yes, Augie, you are a wonder. And that ends the book. So I think that would be the climactic moment. If not that, certainly the nature reserve trip that they make. Either one would be, a good nomination for that. One more thing before I end this particular video, and then we'll have a few final comments. Anything unrealistic, one of the things we look for in a realistic fiction book is, how realistic is it? And I think there are a couple of things that maybe not quite realistic, and I think we brought up one earlier. A lot of you mentioned this, the fact that, Augie goes through all of these surgeries, which must be outrageously expensive. And it's very convenient that, his parents, well, particularly his father, must have a really well-paying job to live in this fancy brownstone in New York and be able to afford to send his kids to private schools. And, so the money issue doesn't even come up. And of course, to them, or, because they apparently can afford it. And I'm just wondering, as some of you did, well, if this story took place in some other part of the country where the child did not have the benefit of rich parents, the story might be very, very different. How he might have survived in a public school setting, for example. A private school, it's tough enough in a private school, but I have a feeling it would have been 100 times worse in a public school. So I think Palacio is very clever to avoid that kind of issue by just making his parents rich and being able to afford to send Augie to this, very prestigious private school where everybody acts very polite, or at least for the most part. A couple of the parents don't act very well. Julian's parents don't act very well, for example. So that's kind of a fair point, I think. Somebody mentioned, too, that nowadays kids aren't allowed to wear masks at Halloween in school at parties. So that's a little rule that is kind of broken in the book. But I think for the most part, I'd like to think the book handles a lot of the issues that we've talked about realistically. And so you let some of these other things go, so to speak. All right, I'll end right here, and then we'll wrap things up in part 4.